It was the summer of 1974. They were on their honeymoon in a cozy cottage by the lake. In another town, an hour away, a beautiful college student murdered. Were they connected? In court, decades later, the secrets would tumble out.
First thing I said to him was, "How did you get the blood on your clothes?"
Would this cold case ever be solved?
Hello, I'm Dan Abrams, and welcome to Chasing Justice. One night in a Midwestern town, a young woman lay dead. And on that same night, miles away, another young woman lay sleeping on the first night of her honeymoon. These two women would become the center of a murder mystery that stretched for decades. A case that many detectives thought might never be closed. Here's Chris Hansen.
It was the summer of 1974, Saginaw, Michigan. 21-year-old Cheryl Miller had just moved into an apartment with a roommate and worked part-time at a bakery to make ends meet while attending college. Cheryl's aunt, Donna Duquette.
She just had all the qualities that I think that most people would wish they had. She was a shining star.
But on a rainy Saturday morning, Cheryl Miller's roommate returned to this home from a night of partying to find Miller murdered. An autopsy would conclude that she had been raped and strangled. Time of death, between 5:30 and 6 a.m. Retired police detectives Ron Herzberg and Tom Reeder worked the case.
The first thing you think of is, of course, probably someone that knows her.
And in the days after the murder, a suspect emerged, an exchange student from Iran, a former boyfriend named Abbas Esfahani. According to Cheryl's parents, she broke up with him because of his temper. Also, two critical pieces of evidence linked Esfahani to the crime scene: his fingerprint on a rail leading upstairs to the room where the body was found, and dark hairs left on Cheryl Miller's body, judged to be similar to those found on a hairbrush belonging to Esfahani.
They were strikingly similar, according to the Michigan State Police.
Strikingly similar.
Right.
Did you get a chance to interview Esfahani?
We never did get a chance to interview Mr. Esfahani.
It turned out just days after Cheryl Miller's murder, Esfahani, a week ahead of schedule, flew home to Iran. A warrant was issued. Esfahani was arrested. Although he denied committing the murder, hair samples were sent from Iran to Michigan. The hair samples said to come from Esfahani, sent by the Iranian police, were examined and found not to be similar to the hairs found on the victim's body. But something strange was going on, because the hairs said to be Esfahani's did not even match the hairs taken from his own hairbrush left behind in his hasty departure from Michigan. Did that seem fishy to you?
I would have rather been there when the hair samples were taken from Mr. Esfahani. But when he's in Iran and we're here, you do the best you can.
Because the hairs didn't match and police had little other evidence against him, 5 months after Cheryl Miller's murder, Abbas Esfahani was no longer considered the prime suspect by authorities. He never returned to the United States. How frustrating was that for you as a detective at the time?
Very frustrating.
During the next 2 years, Saginaw police would question more than 150 people and narrow their investigation to 3 suspects. In addition to Esfahani, there was this man, Antonio Alvarez, a cousin of the victim's roommate. He lived at the house for a time, and the dark hairs found on the body were also found to be similar to his hair. Then there was suspect number 3, Gabriel Ferris.
He was a man about town, party guy, sold drugs, used drugs.
27-year-old Gabriel Ferris had come from a well-to-do family in Saginaw, but had spent time in prison on drug charges. Ferris had dated the victim. Detectives Reeder met with Ferris several times, and something about the guy didn't seem right. Did you think that maybe this guy was the killer?
Absolutely.
Just by his behavior?
Right, my instincts. He was very nervous, so I was really suspicious of him.
Although he didn't have dark hair similar to what was found on the victim's body, other pieces of the puzzle seemed to fit. Ferris admitted having a sexual relationship with Cheryl Miller up to the week before her murder, and police found Ferris's fingerprints on a dresser near Cheryl Miller's body. Still, Ferris seemed to have an alibi as solid as any imaginable. He said the night of the murder he was 65 miles away in a cottage by Lake Huron, celebrating the first night of his honeymoon, making love to his new wife.
went to the prosecutor and laid out the whole case. And he said, bring me one more piece of evidence that we can come up with, and we will definitely issue a warrant. Just give me one more piece.
Were you ever able to find that one extra piece of
I was not.
Cheryl Miller's murder would soon enter the cold case files, and it would stay there for nearly 2 decades, until 1994, when police detectives in Saginaw reopened the case. They quickly zeroed in on a suspect, Gabriel Ferris. And his arrest was just the beginning of a strange trip through Michigan's justice system. In 2004, 55-year-old Gabriel Ferris was on trial for the murder of Cheryl Miller 30 years earlier. If convicted, he could face life in prison. Saginaw County Assistant Prosecutor Jeff Stroud.
He killed her. He choked her. He squeezed the life right out of her.
When Ferris's trial began, it quickly became clear why police had focused on him. Prosecutors would present a parade of witnesses who said that in the years since the crime, Ferris had a habit of making odd and incriminating statements about the murder, like the one heard by one of Ferris's former roommates, read into testimony.
He said that when he was making love to her, he didn't mean to do it.
And an ex-girlfriend who said Ferris had made strange statements back in 1976, 2 years after Cheryl Miller was killed.
He just kept saying, I didn't mean to do it. I didn't mean to do it.
But what physical evidence was there to back up those claims? The state honed in on 2 fingerprints, Ferris's, found on the victim's dresser. They used a dummy to demonstrate that those prints, just inches from the victim's head, could only have been left by a man who was committing murder.
That would put him in a position of being on top of Cheryl Miller, either at a time when they are attempting or having sexual relations, or at the time that he's strangling her.
Next, prosecutors called to the stand the one woman whose testimony was crucial to the case.
There at this time the people called Terry Igaz.
Terry Igaz is Gabriel Ferris's former wife. She's the woman Ferris was honeymooning with the night of the murder. But she took the stand not to defend her now ex-husband, but as another woman wronged by Ferris. Igaz, who requested she not be photographed on the witness stand, testified that as the sun was coming up, she saw Gabriel Ferris returning to their honeymoon cottage.
I heard the door to the house slamming and Gabriel coming up the stairs.
She noticed his clothes were bloodied.
He said, I hit a rabbit with your car, and he got hung up in the wheel well, and I had to pull him out. And that's how I got the blood on my clothes.
Ferris's ex-wife testified that same night in their honeymoon cottage, Ferris turned on the 11 o'clock news.
When it was talking about Cheryl Miller, he told me that that was the last girlfriend he'd had before me.
Did he tell you that he had a date with her the night before your wedding?
No.
And that, prosecutors would claim, was the motive behind the murder, because it turns out that Gabriel Ferris had set up a date with Cheryl Miller the night before his wedding. But he couldn't make it, so prosecutors theorized Ferris went to see Cheryl at his very next opportunity, the first night of his honeymoon.
Did he go there intending to rape her? Probably not. He may have gone there very well intending to have sex with her, and she said, look, you're married. I'm not having sex with you. And that angered him, and an argument ensued, and he ended up strangling her.
Prosecutors rested their case, confident that they'd proven Gabriel Ferris had the means, motive, and thanks to his ex-wife's testimony, the opportunity to kill Cheryl Miller. The defense would now get the chance it had been waiting for, to prove that the evidence pointed not to Ferris, but to another killer still on the loose. Gabriel Ferris had spent 6 days in a Michigan courtroom listening to the state label him a scoundrel, a cheating husband who'd lied to his new wife in 1974 and slipped out of his honeymoon bed to drive an hour for one final rendezvous with Cheryl Miller, a visit, they said, that ended in murder. But it turns out that there is much more to the story of Gabriel Ferris than what prosecutors told. In fact, this was the third time that Ferris had been tried for the murder of Cheryl Miller. In his previous trials, there'd been one hung jury and one conviction, later tossed out. And Michigan's Court of Appeals had come down hard on the Saginaw authorities who had prosecuted Ferris, even ruling that prosecutors once allowed a jailhouse snitch to testify falsely that he didn't expect a deal in exchange for his testimony against Ferris.
Have you ever seen a prosecution quite like this?
Well, it's not only the prosecution, it was the judge. There was prosecutorial misconduct and ineffective assistance to defense counsel. And that's the trifecta of injustice.
Attorney David Nicola and law professor David Moran are among those who've represented Ferris during his odyssey through Michigan's justice system.
How would you characterize this case to somebody who is totally unfamiliar with the twists and turns?
It's prosecution theory that somebody on their honeymoon night, for no apparent reason, sneaks out and rapes and kills an ex-girlfriend is so strange that I thought, there's got to be more to this story. It doesn't make any sense.
Now, Ferris had another chance to convince a jury of his innocence. And new trial attorney Dan Willman believed the jury could only conclude that Ferris was not guilty. Why? A lack of physical evidence.
Was there any of Gabe Ferris's hair found at the crime scene?
None.
Semen?
None.
Blood? Skin tissue?
Nothing.
What does that say about this case?
I think it's a very weak case.
A weak case, the defense argued, even though Gabriel Ferris's fingerprint was found on a dresser just a few inches from the victim's head. Ferris claimed he and Cheryl Miller had sex all over the bedroom, and fingerprint analysts were forced to admit they couldn't prove the prints were left the night of the murder.
So you didn't know when it was made?
The defense argument was simple. There was far less reason to believe that Ferris had committed the murder and more reason to believe someone else had done it. First, the defense brought up the original suspect, Abbas Esfahani. You'll recall he was the victim's former boyfriend, described as hot-tempered, who made a hasty return to Iran in the days after the murder. Esfahani's fingerprints were found on the banister leading up to the murder scene.
What do you think happened?
Miss Miller dumped Mr. Esfahani. And I don't believe he could take that. He was a jilted lover. That has all the ingredients for the recipe of murder.
Next, remember the second suspect police had focused on?
Antonio Alvarez.
Tony Alvarez was the cousin of the victim's roommate. 30 years later, the defense had some questions for him. Prosecutors now admitted the dark hairs found on the victim's body were his.
Were you in the room when Cheryl Miller was murdered?
No.
Any explanation, any at all, for your hairs being there?
No.
It turned out that the hairs weren't the only piece of evidence linking Alvarez to the murder, because listen to what Alvarez once told an undercover cop.
See, I know who did it, but I'm not going to tell the pigs.
It's just something...
Just shooting your mouth off?
Yeah, exactly.
After pointing to other viable suspects, the defense was about to drop a bombshell. The medical examiner found something highly unusual left behind, he believed, by the man who raped and murdered Cheryl Miller.
He told the two detectives that he found a large quantity of semen, and what was remarkable was not finding sperm.
Indicating that whoever raped Cheryl Miller was sterile.
Right.
It was true. Police and medical reports said whoever raped and murdered Cheryl Miller was sterile, and for years detectives pursued that lead, looking for a sterile killer.
You had Ferris tested.
We did. And the test results came back that he had a normal sperm count.
Could a person with a normal sperm count have raped Cheryl Miller?
Almost impossible.
And the defense moved to bolster this stunning evidence by calling one of the nation's leading experts on male reproduction to back up the claim that Ferris could not be the killer.
If he's fertile today, would you expect it in 1974 he would have been infertile at any time?
If he's fertile now, he almost certainly would have been fertile then.
The original medical examiner had concluded that whoever raped Cheryl Miller was sterile.
The problem with that turned out to be Abbas Esfahani is not sterile, Tony Alvarez is not sterile, Gabe Ferris is not sterile. So even of the pool of suspects that the defense argued could have committed this crime, none of them were sterile.
Maybe none of them committed the crime.
Well, there's always, I suppose, that possibility. And again, if you take just that single piece of evidence, you can create whatever doubt you wish to create.
The defense was focused on presenting hard physical evidence to show the jury that Gabriel Ferris could not be the killer. What it said were hairs and semen that didn't come from Ferris. Now it was time for them to question the credibility of the witness at the center of the prosecution's case, Ferris's ex-wife.
Terry Lynn Igas.
The woman Ferris had married 2 days before the murder. The defense attempted to portray her as an ex-wife with an axe to grind, who had, before changing her story, once provided Ferris with an airtight alibi for the morning of the murder.
Now, in your very first statement also, you mentioned that you went to bed at midnight, isn't that correct? And you got up at noon.
That's what I thought.
I also asked you, did Gabe get up? Did you feel him moving around or anything like that? And you said no, he didn't get up. He stayed in bed the whole time.
That's what I thought.
But 2 days later, she went back to police with new details, including claims that Ferris had left the home and returned with blood on his clothes.
Your very first statement, why didn't you give out those particular details?
It just didn't roll off like that.
Ma'am, 2 years after this happened, did you say, I don't know if it was a dream or what?
That was when I was first remembering.
So you think your memory's better 30 years later now?
It hasn't changed since.
She told police at one point that this may have all happened in a dream of hers.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct.
What does that say about her credibility as a witness?
I think it sinks it. Your Honor, the defense rests.
But before the judge would send the jury to deliberate, prosecutors would get one last chance to explain why science could still show that Gabriel Ferris was the real killer. The defense had raised the question, how could Gabriel Ferris, a natural blonde with a normal sperm count, have raped and murdered Cheryl Miller when forensic experts working the case back in 1974 had told detectives to look for a dark-haired killer who was sterile? The state was about to admit that the original detectives and scientists on the case misread the evidence and followed the wrong leads.
These are packages that I received on the 20th of June, 1974.
First to the stand, the former crime lab scientist who had examined the hairs found on the victim's body. Even though for years he had told police they were looking for a dark-haired killer, similar to original suspects Esfahani and Alvarez, he now said this.
If the woman laying there were to have struggled and rolled on that rug, could she pick up hairs on her body from that rug?
Yes, you certainly could, yes.
In other words, prosecutors now argued that those dark hairs found on the body, long thought to have been left by the killer, did not come from the killer at all. The expert testified the hairs were not pulled out in a fierce struggle, but had been left behind by people who'd simply been in the house and shed the hairs naturally. And when Cheryl Miller struggled with the killer, the expert testified, the hairs came off the rug and stuck to her body. But what about the startling defense claim that the killer was sterile and Ferris was not? Prosecutors now had a new explanation for that evidence as well.
There were no spermatozoa on that slide.
Saginaw County's chief medical examiner testified that the pathologist who told police they were looking for a sterile killer 30 years before was simply wrong. In fact, the ME testified that the substance was not even semen at all, but came from the victim instead. And that conclusion was backed up by another scientist who'd examined slides of the substance taken from the victim's body.
The test was negative for the presence of seminal fluid.
The question for prosecutors, without semen, how could they prove that a rape even occurred?
If you have a rape case, wouldn't you have a semen sample that you could use to tie the rapist to the rape?
If the rapist doesn't ejaculate, you have no semen sample. In this case, our supposition was that Mr. Ferris was choking Cheryl Miller to get her to participate in this act, and he killed her. And in that instance, he may very well have lost the desire to complete the act.
The defense had one last chance to respond, blasting the prosecution experts and claiming that the sample was indeed semen. They also questioned why none of Gabriel Ferris's hairs ended up on the victim's body.
It doesn't make sense. When you have a violent struggle with an especially hairy defendant, you would expect to find at least some of his hair at the scene, and you wouldn't expect that all of the hair found in the body is dark hair, which doesn't match her and doesn't match him.
Each side had made its arguments. It was now time for the jury to decide if Gabriel Ferris would walk free or spend the rest of his life behind bars. As they awaited the verdict, it might be an understatement to say that Gabriel Ferris and his defense attorney were anticipating good news.
He was talking about buying a sailboat.
You want to announce the verdict of the jury?
Yes, Your Honor. We find the defendant, Gabriel Ferris, guilty of felony murder.
Guilty. In June 2004, almost 30 years to the day after Cheryl Miller's body was found, Gabriel Ferris was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Exactly what he deserved, Cheryl's Aunt Donna Duquette says.
He killed Cheryl. He left Cheryl's parents in pain for the rest of their lives. That's an unforgivable thing to do. Unforgivable.
Gabriel Ferris appealed his conviction, but Michigan's Court of Appeals unanimously ruled against him. He then appealed to the Michigan Supreme Court, where he also failed to get a new trial. Ferris still maintains that he's innocent. That's all for this edition of Chasing Justice. For Investigation Discovery, I'm Dan Abrams. Thanks for watching.